Greetings. I would like to begin by expressing my sincere thanks to the organizers of the Delphi Economic Forum for inviting me to chair this panel. It is an honor to chair a panel with my distinguished, esteemed colleagues here. My name is Cemal Kafadar, and I'm a professor of Ottoman history at Harvard University. It is my privilege to introduce the panelists, distinguished, accomplished colleagues with several publications of great relevance for our topic. Our first speaker is Dr. Ioannis Grigoriadis, Associate Professor and Jean Monnet Chair of European Studies at the Department of Political Science and Public Administration at Bilkent University. He is also Senior Fellow and Head of the Program on Turkey at the Hellenic Foundation for European and Foreign Policy. In the academic year 2018-19, he was visiting professor at the Cayman Modern Turkish Studies Program, Buffett Institute for Global Studies, Northwestern University. In the academic year 2016-17, he was IPC Stiftung Mercator Senior Research Fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in Berlin and Stanley J. Seeger Research Fellow at Princeton University. His research interests include comparative European and Turkish politics and history. Our second speaker is Dr. Hakan Erdem, a historian of the Ottoman Empire who holds a PhD in modern history from Oxford University. He worked at Boğaziçi University between 1993 and 2002, and then moved to Sabanci University, where he has been since 2002, both of the universities being in Istanbul. He was also a visiting professor at Ben Gurion University of the Negev in Israel in 1998 and 2001, and at George Washington University, USA in 2000. He specialized in the history of Ottoman slavery, modern state construction in the late Ottoman Empire, repercussions of the Greek War of Independence in the Ottoman Empire, introduction of the new conscript army, transformation of Ottoman political language and culture. Among his various publications, mention must be made of Slavery in the Ottoman Empire and its Demise, 1800-1909. He is also co-editor of 2 volumes on the Middle East, namely Histories of the Modern Middle East, New Directions with Israel Gershoni and Ursula Wokuk, and Middle East Historiographies narrating the 20th century with Israel Gershoni again and with Amy Singer. He authored 2 books in Turkish, Tarih Lenk, which is a work of historical criticism, and Torosyan'ın Acayip Hikayesi, which is a work on a purported World War I memoir. These books were published in 2008 and 2012, respectively. He is also the author of 3 novels in Turkish. Sukru Ilicak is our third speaker. Dr. Ilicak pursued his studies in Turkey, Greece, and the USA, specializing in the so-called Ottoman 3 nations, namely the Greeks, Armenians, and Jews. He received his PhD degree from Harvard University in 2011 with a dissertation entitled A Radical Rethinking of Empire, Ottoman State and Society During the Greek War of Independence, 1821-1826. His dissertation investigates the Greek War of Independence as an Ottoman experience, exploring in particular how Sultan Mahmud II, who reigned between 1808 and 39, and the central state of the Ottoman Empire, central state elite, tried to make sense of and reacted to the rapidly changing world around them. He has published broadly on the Greek War of Independence and the 3 nations. He is currently a fellow of the Institute for Mediterranean Studies in Rethymnon, Crete. Our fourth speaker, Dr. Christine Philliou, is professor in the Department of History at UC Berkeley. She is the author of 2 books on different aspects of the long 19th century in the Ottoman Empire and the emergence of Greece and Turkey out of that empire. Her first book, Biography of an Empire, Governing Ottomans in an Age of Revolution was published in 2010, and the Greek edition is forthcoming in September with Alexandria Publications. That first book examines the changes in Ottoman governance resulting from the Greek War of Independence from the perspective of Greek Phanariot elites. Her new book, Turkey, A Past Against History, is fresh out of the printing press, published in 2021, with a Greek edition forthcoming in 2022, again with Alexandria, turns to the final decades of the Ottoman Empire and the transition to the Republic of Turkey from the perspective of a dissident, opposition figure, and satirist who experienced the changes firsthand. Fluent in both Greek and Turkish, she has spent her career researching both the conflicts and the moments of symbiosis between Greeks and Turks as the Ottoman Empire devolved and the modern states of Greece and Turkey took shape. I look forward to listening to my four dear colleagues, and without further ado, I turn to Dr. Janis Grigoriadis for the first presentation of the panel. Janis, please.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Professor Kafadar, for your introduction, your very kind words. It's an honor, a pleasure to be with you in this Delphi Economic Forum panel that is going to participate in the commemoration of the bicentennial of the Greek War of Independence through shedding light on this very important event, of enormous historical proportions for our regions, from an Ottoman point of view. My presentation is going to be shedding light on a side story of the Greek War of Independence that affected a part of the Greek Orthodox millet that was part of the Greek Orthodox world in the Ottoman Empire, but has since the 19th century been relatively little studied by Greek historiography and by Ottoman historiography as well. So my presentation is going to look into how the Greek War of Independence affected the sectarian dynamics in Syria and why Syria matters. I think that Syria matters because it gives us a very interesting insight on how the identity dynamics within the Orthodox community of the Ottoman Empire played from the 18th century all the way into the late 19th century and the early 20th century. So normally when we talk about the Greek War of Independence, we focus on its effect on the Balkans, of course, and this is very reasonable given the fact that like in the Wallachian provinces and then Moldova, there was the operation by Alexandros Ypsilantis, then the war started in the Peloponnese, in continental Greece, and in the islands. But it is important to highlight the effects of this event reached as far as Aleppo. So I will be spending some time explaining why Aleppo matters in that respect, and why the Greek War of Independence had a catalytic influence on the identity dynamics of Syria throughout the 19th century. Why this is the case? Well, I think it's important to remember that Syria was a territory far beyond the reach of the ecumenical patriarchate. Syria belonged ecclesiastically to the Patriarchate of Antioch, and throughout the Byzantine years, these territories were mostly beyond the reach of the Byzantine Empire. Since the 7th century, the Umayyad, the Abbasid empires controlled much of the Levant, and although there were, of course, several wars between the Byzantine Empire and these empires for reclaiming the territories, these territories remained mostly beyond the area of the Byzantine Empire. So the Greek Orthodox populations of Syria remained under the jurisdiction of the Patriarchate of Antioch, which was itself based first in Antioch and then in Damascus. But what is happening already in the late 17th century, and I think this is very important to highlight, is that the Ottoman Empire considers the Orthodox Church and the Ecumenical Patriarchate as an institution that should be supported against the attempts of Catholics to infiltrate the Ottoman Empire through missionary activities and through the establishment of uniate Greek Catholic communities in different parts of the Ottoman territory. This situation was present in the Aegean island and in other parts of the Balkans, but in the late 17th, early 18th century, the area of Aleppo becomes an area of intensive missionary activity by mainly French missionaries. This is the time when the French state and the Ottoman Empire have relatively good relations compared to other European states at the time. So there emerges a community which is Greek Catholic. So they are belong to the Orthodox cultural right, but they declare their allegiance to the Pope. And they adopt, interestingly, a name that used to be the name of the Greek Orthodox community of the early Arab empires, Melkites, so the royalists, practically, because in the early Arab literature, the king was the Byzantine emperor. So, as this is happening in the early 18th century, the Ecumenical Patriarchate requests from the Ottoman state to take over the administration of the Diocese of Aleppo, claiming that the local bishop who was appointed by the Patriarchate of Antioch in Damascus was allowing the conversion of his population to Catholicism. So in that respect, we have an interesting situation here whereby the Ottoman Empire considers the Orthodox Church to be more reliable and more trustworthy compared to the Catholic Church's activities. Of course, the Ottoman-Venetian Wars in the late 17th century, early 18th century, played a role in that respect. So this means that the Patriarchate is able to appoint a new bishop in Aleppo, and the bishop that was already there converts to Catholicism himself. So we have a schism in the Church of Aleppo that defines the life of the Christian community of the city throughout the 18th century. So there is the Melkite community, Greek Catholic community of Aleppo, that is hosting many important merchants, very influential local notables and authorities, on the one hand, and on the other hand, there is the Ecumenical Patriarchate and the local bishop that tries to make them outcasts from the religious point of view and raise to the Ottoman authorities the risk that these activities pose for the Ottoman unity. And of course, under these circumstances, what we call as the millet system is slowly consolidated. It is given fact in recent historiography on the millet system that the millet system was not a product of an agreement that dates back to the 15th century or 16th century, but it was the result of a long-term series of arrangements between Ottoman authorities and the Ecumenical Patriarchate that led to some degree to the consolidation of the power of the Ecumenical Patriarchate over territories that were for many centuries beyond its reach. So, and this was the case both in the Balkans and in the Levant, as in the case of Aleppo. So the Patriarchate is able to come closer to the Ottoman authorities and try to declare the Melkites as heretics that should not enjoy any support from authorities, not have any pious foundations of the Christians. All this should belong to the Orthodox. So this is the situation that goes on throughout the 19th century. Interestingly, the Melkite community tries to refute the fact. The Melkite community tries to say that, no, we're not converts to Catholicism of the 18th or 19th century. We are the true Orthodox Christians. how do they make this claim? They make this claim by referring to the attempts of union of churches in the 15th century, shortly before the fall of Constantinople, that led to this deep split of the Byzantine society between those who supported the union with the Catholic Church and those who opposed the union of the Catholic Church. So in that respect, the Melkites tried to present themselves as the true successors of those who supported the union of churches between the Catholics, the Catholic Orthodox Union back in the 15th century. Nevertheless, the Ottoman authorities avoid to take a clear position on this issue all the way until the 1818, like until the very last years before the outbreak of the Greek War of Independence. And there is a very big irony in this intervention. Why? Because the person that is going to impose the Greek Orthodox views, the Ecumenical Patriarchate's views in Aleppo on the Melkites is an Ottoman official that would later be heavily involved in the suppression of the Greek War of Independence. And this is Khurshid Pasha. Khurshid Pasha is the Vali, is the governor of Aleppo in 1818, when the Patriarchate decides to appoint a new bishop, Bishop Gerasimos, to Aleppo. And the appointment of this new bishop is met with riots by the Melkite population of the city. And Khurshid Pasha takes a clear position in favor of the bishop that the Ecumenical Patriarchate sends, and suppresses the riots by the Melkites, and there are casualties. So there are people dead among the Melkite population in the context of the suppression of these casualties. What is interesting is the argument that Khurshid makes in front of the Melkite leaders. So he's asking them, according to the sources, and I refer here mainly to Bruce Masters' very important work on the history of the Aleppine Christian community and the Melkite community. So Khurshid asks them, who are you? Are you Christians or Muslims or Jews? If you're not Muslims and Jews and you're Christians, then you must be obeying the Patriarchate, the Patriarchate in Constantinople, in Constantinia. So he clearly doesn't allow for any other religious affiliation within the Ottoman realms. There's no space for Catholic or Greek Catholic millet. So in that respect, in 1818, we can witness the triumph of the Greek Orthodox millet and the triumph of the Ecumenical Patriarchate in its claim to represent all the Christian populations, the Orthodox populations within the Ottoman Empire. Well, this is going to be challenged in very few years. As soon as the Greek War of Independence breaks out in 1821, the Patriarchate and the Fanarios, who were considered to be responsible for the independence, and who are those who had put all their influence on the side of the Greek Orthodox community in Aleppo, they fall out of favor with Ottoman authorities. And of course, the Patriarch is hanged, and there are sort of pogroms against Greek Orthodox communities in different parts of the Ottoman Empire. The Melkite community in Aleppo finds an opportunity to capitalize on these events. And interestingly, they argue, along the line of the argument they made before, that you see what happened in the Peloponnese, in Mora, in the Morea. So this proves that the Melkites are the true room. As we told you before, we are the loyal subjects of the Ottoman Empire, the Orthodox, and here they add to the Greek Orthodox of the Balkans, the Greek Orthodox of Aleppo as well. They're Yunan. They're not Rome. So they're very different. And you were very unfair in treating us the way you treated us 3 years ago. So, and this position has a very interesting effect. The Melkites take the upper hand in Aleppo. They're able to claim all the churches that they lost in 1818. And this, most importantly, and I think I would like to highlight the significance of this, leads to the recognition of different millets by the Ottoman authorities. So the decision to recognize the Catholic millet as a result of the Greek War of Independence and what happened in Aleppo leads to the fragmentation of the millet system as it existed in the 18th and early 19th century in the Ottoman Empire. And I think that this is an event of enormous significance, not only for Greek history, but for Ottoman history as a whole, because this triggers the rise of several nationalist movements within the Ottoman Empire, as the Catholic, the Jewish millet, the Syrian millet, the Bulgarian millet, and other millets will emerge in the context of the 19th century. These institutions will form the nucleus for the rise of very important nationalist movements that will transform the Ottoman Empire in an irreversible way and will contribute, of course, to the demise of the Ottoman Empire and the establishment of the modern nation states as we know them since the end of the First World War. So I think that this story from Aleppo tells us a lot about how an event in the Southern Balkans could have a huge influence throughout the Ottoman Empire. And there's a big irony in that respect that when the Greek nation state was established, the Arab-speaking Orthodox of Aleppo or of Lebanon were never considered to be part of the Greek imagined community, while the Turkish-speaking Orthodox of Anatolia were considered to be an essential element of the Greek Orthodox nation, of the Greek nation, the Arab speakers, the Arabic-speaking populations of Syria, of Lebanon, of the Levant in general, were never considered as a part of the Greek nation. And I think this is an interesting irony of history when we compare what happened in 1818 and 1821, that the Greek Orthodox of Aleppo paid a high price for the outbreak of the War of Independence, but they were never considered to be part of the Greek nation thereafter. So I'll stop here as I run out of time. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to our discussion later.
Thank you, Ioannis. This is a very auspicious beginning for a rich conversation, I'm sure. Our next speaker is Dr. Erdem. Hakan, please.
Thank you. First of all, I also thank the organizers of the Delphi Economic Forum, and I also thank Ioannis for this very good beginning. I'll just almost continue where he left. I'll start with terminology as one of my favorite pastimes as a historian. We say Greek Revolution. Truly, it was a revolution of a huge, momentous, monumental character. There's no doubt about that. Like its ilk in the 19th century elsewhere, like the Bolivarian revolutions in Latin America, like in fact a century later the Turkish revolution. But it was a multifaceted event or series of events that transformed not only the people in what we call today Greece, but the whole of Ottoman Empire. It has many aspects. It was a rebellion, a revolt, a war of independence, a war of liberation, a civil war in many terms, and it was a revolution. So this several callings of it, several names need not to be mutually exclusive. Then what about the other part of the compound, the Greek part? Is this also a complicated thing? Yes, I think to a certain extent, even more complicated. The Ottoman Empire had its large Greek community, and they called themselves Romui, the Romans, and the Ottomans accepted that without any questioning. Called them Rum, like the other peoples of the Middle East, like the Persians, like the Arabs. They were Rum, meaning Roman. Then came the revolution. then came the kind of declarations of revolution, like the one issued by Alexander Ypsilantis in the Principalities. There, he talked about Hellenoi. The Ottomans never heard of this, but his declaration had to be translated into Turkish, Ottoman Turkish. They couldn't simply call it, the translators call it the Greeks, because they had their own Greeks, and the Greeks had a name, Romoi or Rum, as the case might be, depending on the native language of the speaker. So precisely at this moment, an ancient Arabic name for Greeks and Greece, ultimately from Ionia, Yunan, came very handy for the Ottomans. Now they translated Hellenoi as Yunan, Yunani. Very good. And the country was Yunanistan, with the famous Persian ending, like other stans. This is where the Greeks stand, basically, Yunanistan. So once they established their terminology, if only not to use the old Ottoman terms Rum and Rumeli, the Ottomans established a new terminology, Yunan, Yunanistan. Then comes the surprise in a way. One Ottoman document at the start of the revolution commented on the term Elas, Yunanistan, this time in Turkish. Greece, that is Yunanistan. Greece, what unspeakable nonsense is this? So, yes, after all, there is an entity called Yunanistan, Greece, Greece of the revolutionaries, but it is utterly nonsensical. So, the first Ottoman reception is flat denial and denigration of the revolutionaries. All of them were bandits, eşkıya in Ottoman Turkish, never paying any attention between clefts or the kinds of Todori Kolokotronis or, the Ypsilanti brothers. All of them were eşkıya. So there is no country called Greece, Yunanistan. There is a flat denial. It is utterly unacceptable. And at times they seemed to have been vindicated when, for example, Kapodistrias was assassinated during the turbulences of the Greek civil war. And one Ottoman document again comments, it was clear that the government of such bandits would create such results. So the first reaction is non-acceptance. Call it denial. However, it means, of course, it implies that the Ottoman administrators utterly failed to grasp the goals of Greek revolutionaries. They made no difference whatsoever between the Greek revolution and previous revolutions or revolts of the subject classes. For example, when the army of the Egyptian governor Muhammad Ali suppressed the revolt on the island of Crete, the Ottoman, the administrators sent feelers and tried to assess the damage on the one side on the villages and tried to learn the intentions of the Greeks, would they join us again? Would they join the Ottoman administration again if we forgive the taxation for such and such years? So this was a kind of attitude. Yes, it tried to react to the Greek War of Independence, but it never occurred to the Ottomans that the Greeks, in fact, wanted to be independent. So they were still trying to find out whether the Greeks, defeated Greek revolutionaries in this case, were willing to join the Ottoman Imperium once again. So after this stage of dismissing the revolution as such, we should move to a different sort of view or point of angle. The fact that the Ottoman administrators did not want to acknowledge such a thing as Greek Revolution, Greece, or Greek people in the sense of Ellenoi doesn't mean that the revolution didn't have any impact on the Ottoman system. As I said at the very beginning, it profoundly transformed not only Greece but the Ottoman Empire. I'm not going to talk about the initial knee-jerk responses of the Ottoman administrators to the Greek Revolution. That includes a variety of measures, but I'm not going to talk unless I'm asked questions, specific questions. I just mentioned two important monumental events that were set off by the Greek Revolution. One is the direct consequence, the other one is indirect. The first one is the evolution of the Central Ottoman Army, the Janissaries, towards the end of the war in 1826 June. That's interesting because not so long ago, in 1808, at the beginning of Mahmud II's reign, there was civil war between the modern army, the Sekbans, and the Janissaries in the streets of Istanbul, and nobody could overcome the other party. There was an impasse, and the Sultan made a formal deal with the Janissaries. The Janissaries implored for amnesty of the Sultan, and in return for that, the Sultan promised that he would never ever establish another army but keep the Janissaries. However, in 1826, he seemed to have broken his pledge and abolished the Janissary army by fire and sword. How could that happen? Actually, I followed this story of the abolition of the Janissary army from documentation available to us. There, mention is made of Greek revolution a lot. The Janissaries are accused of uselessness against or vis-a-vis the Greek rebels. There is a specific Janissary contingent who were badly defeated before Athens sometime in the skirmishes. So the moral of the story from the viewpoint of the Ottoman Sultan was that, you see, they are unable to defeat even the subjects. How could we expect them to defend the empire again against other empires? So there was a large consensus in society and at several layers of Ottoman state that the Janissaries should abolish. And such indeed was the case. The moment they abolished, a new army, a new conscript citizen army was proclaimed. And from this date on, middle of the June 1826 on, in the history of Ottoman Turkish modernization, it is told in a very rosy way that the last stumbling block on the way of reform, the Janissaries, were finally done away with, and therefore, the Sultan could engage in reform, meaning more often than not, state centralization in the Ottoman context, reforms from above. And then it's a short step from the evolution of the Janissaries to the modernization of the Tanzimat, 1839. And in a way, you can follow the story up until the establishment of the Turkish Republic. So the Greek Revolution, in an odd way, not openly pronounced like that, but is instrumental in the modernization of the Ottoman Empire. And in the end, a parallel nation state, this time in Anatolia, admittedly in a belated way, some 100 years later, but still it is a response to the Greek Revolution, or the series of events that were started due to the Greek Revolution. So, of course, I mean, we can criticize this, but this is a different story. The indirect impact, one indirect impact, is the quarrel between the Sultan and his Egyptian governor or viceroy, Mehmed Ali Pasha of Egypt. He sent his navy, defeated at Navarino. He sent his son, Ibrahim Pasha, who basically crushed the rebellion, but he faced a coalition, and in the end, he had to withdraw to Egypt, as we all know. But the Sultan happened to have promised several posts to the family on Crete, in mainland Greece, in the Morea. But since it was a defeat for the Ottoman armies and the empire, the Sultan could not keep his pledge. The Egyptians spent money, and in a way they asked for compensation elsewhere, in Syria, in Palestine. The Ottoman Sultan declined this. Then there was yet another civil war between the Ottoman Empire, Central Ottoman Empire, and Mehmed Ali Pasha of Egypt, fought in two successive waves in early 1830s, and once more in 1839. Great powers interfered, etc. But today, again, many historians accept that Mehmed Ali Pasha was a forerunner of Mahmud II's reforms in more than one way. I don't see it personally like that. I mean, it's more of a dialogue rather than one-side impact. I mean, the Central Ottoman Empire had its impact on the Egyptian province, say during the times of Selim III, but the Egyptian province had its impact on the Central Ottoman Empire during Mehmed Ali Pasha's time in 1830s. I mean, he has an official newspaper, and the Ottoman, Central Ottoman government has one. So, in a way, this indirect event as well had transformative powers on the actually all layers of Ottoman society. Things, of course, can be likened to a billiard game. The revolution itself was the ball. I mean, if you like, as you wish, but or could be another. I'm not good at games, but the very fact is that it was it has been a pivotal series of events that changed a lot in the Ottoman Empire. This was not grasped at first by the Ottoman administrators themselves, but in the end, after the usual stages of denial, denigration, trauma, etc., came the reconciliation as well, part, to the point that Ottomans accepted the independence of a country called Greece. So they stopped talking about such a nonsensical name, Yunanistan. They accepted Yunanistan. Not only that, they accepted Yunanistan, they opened up an embassy in Athens and sending an Ottoman Greek, this time not a Yunan, but a Rum, Muzuruz Pasha, as the ambassador. So meaning that both identities, thanks to the revolution, had to live hand in hand for a considerable time. And I think I should stop here.
Thank you, Hakan. Thank you. I think Sukru will just follow from this rather smoothly. So I turn to Sukru for the
Yes.
third presentation.
Thank you very much. And I wrote my PhD dissertation on the Greek War of Independence under the supervision of Professor Kafadar, who is our chair tonight, and examined this very significant historical event as an Ottoman experience. For my research, I mostly use archival documents from the Ottoman State Archives, which are preserved in Istanbul. Almost 50,000 documents related to this singular event alone exist in these archives, providing us with a treasure trove of exciting information. The primary importance of these documents is that they are a clear testimony of the larger imperial context in which the Greek Revolution evolved and proved successful. Through these documents, we acquire penetrating insights into the workings of Ottoman governance, imperial allegiances, the military, the navy, the commissariat, the economy, and human capital during the revolutionary years. We learn extensively about the political and military forces and allegiances the Sublime Porte strived to mobilize to fight its battles against the Greek revolutionaries, and also about the ways in which it kept the Greek communities that did not rise up under control. The mass of information in these documents clearly denotes a highly ineffective and failing state, which could hardly perform its core functions and exercise only nominal authority over much of its territory, and a desperate but eager Mahmud II, who was the Ottoman Sultan throughout the Greek Revolution. At the time of the Greek Revolution, the Ottoman central state had essentially no army and limited means to raise one. The navy was totally inept and could hardly sail out of the Dardanelles. The Sublime Porte severely lacked the military and naval manpower to put down a national uprising that broke out almost simultaneously throughout the empire, where Greek populations constituted the majority. The Ottoman state was literally at the mercy of Albanian warlords and mercenaries for the suppression of the Greek uprising until the arrival of the Egyptian forces in 1825. So today I am going to talk about what had happened to the Ottoman army, and for this it is necessary to examine briefly the preceding decade. Although full to the brim with events bringing about momentous changes in the fabric of the Ottoman polity, this is one of the most understudied periods of Ottoman history. The Treaty of Bucharest of May 1812, which ended the Russo-Ottoman War of 1806-1812, and Russia's revised non-aggressive imperial agenda in the post-Napoleonic world order, brought about the favorable conditions for a certain clique at the sublime port to deal with the state's internal affairs and to redefine its boundaries with the provincial magnates. We call these provincial magnates the ayans in Turkish, and you can consider them as the Ottoman counterparts of the lords or dukes in England. In other words, hereditary dynastic families that held the military, political, and financial power in the provinces. The Ayans had carved out almost autonomous statelets for themselves in the previous half-century, and since the Rus-Ottoman War of 1786-1774, the Ottoman central state could not raise an army or taxes without their support. However, in the last Russian war, I mean the Rus-Ottoman War of 1806-1812, they declined to lend their military and financial support to the extent desired by the Sublime Porte. Luckily for the Sublime Porte, hostilities were not resumed in the 1812 campaign season due to Napoleon Bonaparte's expedition to Russia, and the war came to an end. In the following decade, the Sublime Porte endeavored to establish a capable defense system. It tried to save itself from being at the mercy of the Ayans by uniting its borderlands under a central authority and by establishing a new provincial army under the command of imperial viziers, whose soldiers would not turn tail and flee when they faced the disciplined bayonet-using Russian soldiers and light artillery. Hence, in February 1813, the Sublime Porte officially announced and embarked upon a military and administrative project to reassert itself in the provinces. Now the imperial viziers, who were under direct control of the Sublime Porte, would replace the Ayans in the provinces. The project brought imperial viziers, who derived their power mostly from the employment of Albanian mercenaries, into direct confrontation with the provincial magnates and allowed the former to subject the locals to additional extortionary practices, causing extreme economic and political distress in the provinces. What followed was, to all intents and purposes, a civil war between the Ottoman central state and a myriad of provincial magnates of varying calibers, religions, ethnicities, and levels of popular support. Official Ottoman documents and chronicles allow us to trace dozens of urban and rural uprisings led by provincial magnates throughout the empire against the Sublime Porte's encroachment. The last and probably the most significant one of these magnates was the legendary Tosk Albanian governor of Ioannina, Ali Pasha Tepelenli, who declined to submit to the Sublime Porte and revolted in 1820. It is not possible to follow every mutiny in detail. We learn about the uprisings of most minor provincial power brokers only when their severed heads made it to Istanbul or through the orders for the confiscation of their patrimony. Popular support to the provincial power brokers' resistance also varied in several provinces. The events were probably limited to the mutiny of the warlords and their men, and either eventually died away or were suppressed by the Sublime Porte. It seems that in some provinces, the common folk were mere observers of the fight between the central state and the magnates, whereas in others, especially in the non-Turkish provinces, the magnates found substantial popular support for their resistance against the Sublime Porte. And we are talking about real warfare with thousands of soldiers on both sides and sieges of such large cities as Diyarbakir, Aleppo, and Ioannina, which were laid by imperial viziers and lasted for many months. I suggest the term de-ionization instead of centralization for this procedure, because while what was destroyed and dismantled is apparent, for instance, the elimination of a magnate or of his entire family and retinue. What exactly replaced the old structures appears to have varied according to the particular conditions in each province and did not necessarily result in establishing the authority of the central state. In any event, the Greek Revolution broke out right in the middle of this period of immense transition. By 1821, the process in the Asiatic provinces of the empire was almost complete and terminated in the European provinces due to the beginning of the Greek Revolution. After almost a decade of internal warfare, large sections of the empire were ruined, and the Sublime Porte had exhausted its pool of military manpower. The elimination of some of the most powerful provincial political and military brokers had serious implications for troop recruitment. Provincial magnates were toppled hastily without replacing their networks and infrastructures with effective alternatives. Consequently, the imperial viziers, such as Kütahi and Khurshid, who replaced the magnates, found it extremely difficult to recruit, mobilize, and fund soldiers. Strongly reminiscent of the circumstances attending the dissolution of several ancient empires, the Sublime Porte was obliged to resort to the Ottoman violence market, whose most important providers at the time were Muslim Albanian magnates, Kum warlords. Let me give you some figures so that you have a better understanding of the effect of the Sublime Porte's de-Ionization project on the Greek Revolution. For the summer campaign of 1811 against the Russians in the lower Danube region, 153 ethnic Turkish Ions from Asia Minor alone were ordered to join the imperial army. 12 years later, however, in 1823, for the first planned and somewhat coordinated military expedition of the Sublime Porte for the suppression of the Greek uprising, there was not a single Ion from Asia Minor in the Ottoman army encampment in Larissa. And a mere 12,000 out of 50,000 soldiers had been recruited by the Ions of Rumelia, in other words, the European provinces of the empire. The rest were Albanian mercenaries. However, the Sublime Porte made a serious miscalculation by composing the bulk of the army from an ethnic group which was not external to the issue, as the insurgent Greeks' immediate neighbors, Albanian warlords and mercenaries, were at the very heart of the matter and were eager to pursue their survival instincts. They followed their own agendas to the utmost of their capability and remained quite unresponsive to the Sublime Porte's demands. Their averseness to put on a united Muslim front against the Greeks proved to be the most important obstacle for the Sublime Porte to suppress the Greek Revolution. The Albanians did everything in their power to paralyze the Sublime Porte's operations. The policy of the Albanians during the actual contest of the Greeks with the Sublime Porte, though not allowed, was in fact that of an armed neutrality, secretly counteracting the Turks when they were likely to gain the ascendant, and checking the Greeks when they were inclined to encroach upon the Albanian interests. Temporizing and evading as far as possible the execution of orders were the most essential qualities of the Albanian armed neutrality policy. Ottoman army encampments and castles in and around the Morea were in a state of continuous unrest and trouble, mostly because of Tosk Albanian mercenaries. Clearly, to the Sublime Porte, the Greek Revolution was just as much an Albanian problem as it was a Greek one. This is an unknown aspect in the historiography of the Greek War of Independence because mainstream Greek historiography has de-Ottomanized the Greek Revolution and has taken it out of the larger world in which it had evolved and moved it to a universe of its own. As a result, most students of the period tend to downplay the role of the Albanian element. One way to achieve this is to treat Muslim Albanians as Turks, either by naming them Turk Albani or completely ignoring their Albanian identity, and Christian Albanians as Greeks, reducing the events to a tug-of-war between two ostensible sides. The picture is much more complicated, though. On the field, the Greek War of Independence was a power struggle among a multitude of players with incessant realignment of interests and redistribution of power. So, can the Greek Revolution be considered as a link in the chain of ongoing uprisings throughout the Ottoman Empire? Mainstream historiography on the Greek Revolution is already a panegyric account of the deeds of the Greek magnates cum warlords. Although more recent Greek historiography tends to give more credit to the enlightened and politicized radical Greeks who shared the sparks of enlightenment with the Greek magnates, it requires extensive research to assess how apprehensive were the Greek Kojabashides, Kapetani, and Armatoli of the Sublime Port's boundary-shifting enterprise in the provinces, and whether they were waiting for their turn to come after the Albanians, after the Tepetenanli revolt. Let's not forget, these Greek provincial power brokers were the actual driving force of the Greek Revolution by providing the bulk of the fighting power. I guess I should stop here and maybe we can discuss some issues afterwards.
Thank you, Sukru. Thank you for a close-up. And now we turn to Christine Philliou for our final presentation, to be followed by a discussion amongst us. Please, Christine, it's yours.
Thank you so much, Cemal. I'd like to thank the organizers of the Delphi Economic Forum for their kind invitation to speak here. It's a pleasure and an honor to be with you today, and I'm happy to add one or two more layers of complication to the discussion that my esteemed colleagues and fellow panelists have already gotten going. I'd like to take a moment to applaud and commend the organizers for including this on the bicentennial year of the outbreak of the Greek War of Independence from Ottoman rule. Ottoman views of the Greek War of Independence. Let's think about a few other comparable contexts in order to understand how unthinkable it would be, and thus how extraordinary it is to be included at all in a forum such as this, organized in Greece and by Greeks. Let's take, for instance, the bicentennial of the Declaration of Independence in the United States in 1976, for instance. It would have been totally unthinkable and even bizarre in 1976 to include a panel on British views of the American Revolution. Let's take the example of the centennial that passed already in 2019 of the start of the Turkish War of Independence from Ottoman rule, which is actually what it was, in addition to being perceived by Turks as the War of Independence from British, French, and Greek occupation. Indeed, in my latest book, I do look at what you might consider Ottoman views of the Turkish War of Independence, but that is for another day. That centennial, in any case, and as far as I know, did not see nearly the level of fanfare in 2019 as this bicentennial is seeing in Greece in 2021. Perhaps 2023, with the centennial of the establishment of the Republic of Turkey, we will see more activity. But even so, to celebrate or even discuss the Turkish War of Independence from the perspective of the Ottoman government in Istanbul, not to mention from the point of view of Greek communities of Asia Minor or the Greek army, would be anathema, quite literally. And indeed, there is no direct political benefit to this conversation that we're having about Ottoman views of the Greek War of Independence. In fact, given the framework of discussion, there could actually be many negative political consequences to it. Would looking at these events through an Ottoman lens mean that we're siding with the empire? With so much tension between Greece and Turkey right now, with so much aggression being threatened, with the perennial political conflict seeing one of its worst moments in recent memory, why bother imagining and publicly discussing Ottoman perspectives and for me it is a matter of multiple Ottoman perspectives, not just one, of the Greek War of Independence. Are we lionizing the Ottomans and therefore, quote, the Turks? What benefit does this new perspective bring to the bicentennial conversation about 1821? And positionality. My colleagues speaking with me on this panel, scholars who've done important research on perceptions and policies taken by the Ottoman state in the course of the Greek Revolution, are hardly cheerleaders for the Ottoman state, and neither am I. We're scholars, and particularly historians, and in fact, this means we're not cheerleaders for anyone. Instead, we're interested in trying to understand the causes, processes, experiences, and predicaments of those involved on multiple sides of the conflict between Greeks fighting for an independent state and the array of Ottoman state loyalists in the 1820s. When we go back and read the documents from the various groups involved in the conflicts of the 1820s, as my esteemed colleagues and fellow panelists have demonstrated in at least 3 different ways, things look very different and much more complicated. And this can be uncomfortable because it unsettles our assumptions about the past, about the neat lines of conflict, and perhaps might force us to think differently about the present. Allow me to quote from a master historian of the 19th century. Men make their own history, but they do not make it they do not make it under circumstances of their own choosing, but under circumstances given and transmitted from the past. What makes the Greek War of Independence and the establishment of the independent state of Greece so extraordinary, of course, is that some men came together and actually radically changed their circumstances to the extent that they could. Many, I'm sure, would have preferred to forego great power tutelage then as now, so even they were not free to shape all of their circumstances in every way. They succeeded in carving out a politically sovereign entity based on belonging to a Greek linguistic and ethnic identity and adherence to Greek Orthodox Christianity. They broke free from Ottoman sovereignty and created an internationally recognized state and a new consensus among themselves for how to organize their polity. In order to understand that achievement and to grasp its meaning then and now, I will complicate the picture, because it was not just a conflict that implicated Ottomans in the sense of those officially associated with the Ottoman state and Greeks as in Greek revolutionaries. There was another category, or many others. As we all know, many more Greek people were left out of this settlement for an independent Greece than were inhabitants and citizens of the original Greek state. Namely, Greek Orthodox Christians who remained in the Ottoman Empire, and each of you has referred to them in different ways and in passing. In my work, in Biography of an Empire, I carefully considered how history and how the predicament of the empire, their perspective in the 1820s, and how their circumstances had been shaped and how they attempted to shape them in different ways over the course of the previous century. In order to do this, one has to consider what it meant, after all, to be an Ottoman, for by the early 19th century, it was not a self-evident category, and both Sukru and Hakan explained the tensions within that category and the kinds of accusations and real anxiety that was happening about what it meant to be a ruler and a member of the ruling class or not at that moment. Neither was the term coterminous with Turk, as we might imagine it and use that term today. In this frame, when we try to break free of anachronism and really understand the moment and the conflict as it was experienced by those living through it, these Greek Orthodox subjects of the Ottoman Empire in the 1820s, and particularly those elites that called themselves and were called phanariates, were not yet the, quote, unredeemed Greeks looking to Athens. This would happen only decades later. They were Ottoman subjects whose world revolved around Istanbul or Constantinople, the Ottoman capital, the former Byzantine capital, and the seat of the Greek Orthodox Church. They lived under a complex set of circumstances which were not of their own choosing. They were guaranteed nothing in the Ottoman realm, neither equality nor rights, legal, social, or cultural. And yet they had shaped some of their circumstances, achieved a remarkable level of wealth and influence, not just in commerce and with respect to the Patriarchate, but with the Ottoman imperial government, due to their involvement in provincial administration, diplomacy, and administration of the Greek Orthodox millet, or confessional community. And I would add that in the months and few years leading up to 1821, I even demonstrate that there were several signs of a kind of institutionalization or formalization of their power. And these signs prompt some really interesting and potentially very unsettling questions about the processes that were going on within the broader Greek community at the time, and what some of the triggers might have been for the initial outbreak of rebellions in Moldavia in early 1821. So certainly, as we all know, some Phanariates fought and even led the movement for Greek independence. Alexander Ypsilantis and Mavrocordatos come to mind, but they left behind others who ascended to positions of power and wealth in the empire in the 1830s and after, the Neo-Phanariates. And we even see, in at least one case, even in the thick of conflict in the 1820s, when, you know, our assumption and really what we know is that Greeks were eliminated, Phanariates were eliminated from these positions due to the suspicion that they were collaborating with the Greek revolutionaries. We even see at least one case of one of them, namely Stephanos Vogoridis, who is continued to be invested with a position with the Kaimakam of Moldavia, and then as a negotiator with the Greeks on behalf of the Ottomans in the 1820s. So even in the worst moment of that conflict, they still had a need for someone of that Phanariate class. Of course, from the 1830s and after, these neo-Phanariates would go on, again, as mentioned by Hakan, some of them would go on to even represent the Ottoman Empire, for instance, in Athens, and then in London for much of the Victorian period, Kostaki Musuros Pasha. And even later in the crucial negotiations, such as the conquest of Berlin in 1878, Alexander Karatheodori Pasha. These Greeks were embedded in many sectors of Ottoman governance before 1821 as after, in different ways. They were interpreters, before particularly, they were interpreters within the Ottoman military, administrators and tax collectors in the Danubian principalities of Moldavia and Wallachia, negotiators for matters between the Ottoman state and foreign states, between the Ottoman state and the Ecumenical Patriarchate, and between the Patriarchate of Constantinople and the other patriarchates, monasteries, and communities within the empire. They were procurers of food and other necessities, as well as luxury items for the palace and for the capital. They were embedded in patronage networks within the Ottoman court and in the military leadership, as I show in the book, particularly with the examples of Halet Efendi and Husrev Pasha, some of the most important figures of that moment. And yet, of course, they had no formal share in governance or imperial policy. On the one hand, their presence and influence was contingent on the favor of the Sultan and his viziers. On the other, their skills were increasingly necessary for the survival of the Ottoman state in the international realm. The Greek Revolution was experienced very differently by these communities, and particularly the Greek community in Istanbul, who suffered massacres and burning of churches and pogroms, as others have said, as reprisals for the far-off rebellions, first in Moldavia and then in the Peloponnese. And I go into great detail about these massacres in the spring of 1821 in the Ottoman capital. I do not have time to provide you with those details, but suffice it to say that the hanging of Patriarch Grigorios V was but one event in a shocking series of atrocities, and even that hanging appears very different when we see it through the eyes of a local Greek eyewitness, as I do in my book. I do not make these points simply for the sake of myth-busting, but as a historian to remind us that when events come to take on such monumental importance in the story that a nation tells about itself, we often lose the connection with the fact that these were actual events experienced by people in their own historical context. To try to understand the hanging of Patriarch Grigorios V, or the Greek War of Independence more generally from the perspective of Phanariates, is in fact a project to recontextualize the movement for and achievement of Greek statehood in its contemporary moment. separate from the aspirations at the time or the ideologies, politics, and historical narrative that took shape later. And these Phanariot elites, who remained in the Ottoman capital, also experienced firsthand the larger transformation in Ottoman governance that resulted from the Greek Revolution, including, I argue in the book, the dramatic shift in the relationship between the Ottoman state and the sphere of diplomacy and geopolitics as the great powers and Congress Europe took shape. This shift, along with the institutional reforms known as the Tanzimat, which began in earnest in 1839, actually opened new opportunities for neo-Phanariots, with their skills and connections within the empire and in Europe, independently of the new Greek state that was developing alongside in Athens. These Greeks did not have a sovereign entity of their own in the sense of a nation state, but their experience as Greeks is worth our attention. Their relationship to the Ottoman state, to their local Greek communities and foreign envoys, and ultimately to the Greek, where some people would go, attain citizenship, and return to Ottoman realms, was complex and generally unstable, which meant that maintaining an equilibrium, indeed surviving, took constant care. This is an uncomfortable topic, and these are uncomfortable questions for sure. If we apply national categories onto the past, these people look like traitors to the Greek nation and collaborators with the Ottomans. And believe me, I spare no one in my work. My recent book looks at Turks who have been made out to be traitors to the Turkish nation because of the positions they took against the Turkish national movement in 1919. I wish I could give you an easy take-home message about these communities of Greeks who remained outside the bounds of the Greek state. I'm afraid I cannot, but I can say that the Ottoman views of the Greek War of Independence were not limited to the official decrees of the Ottoman central government, as important as those are, nor to the massacres and other reprisals carried out by the Muslim Ottoman subjects and soldiers in response to the rebellions. Instead, this Hellenism, these homogenes, which is a word that has not yet been brought up, and I think it's worth discussing if we have a few moments in the discussion, predated the Greek War of Independence and the Greek kingdom. They also continued to live as homogenes long after. They were attached in important and profound ways to Ottomans, despite being constantly suspect in the eyes of their overlords and harboring deep ambivalence toward them in return. These Phanariots had different interests, both from the Ottoman state and from their Greek national counterparts. We owe it to ourselves as Greeks, those of us that are Greek, and as historians of the Ottoman Empire and of Hellenism, to consider distinctive. Doing so enriches our understanding of what it did and did not mean to achieve independent statehood for Greece. Indeed, consideration of multiple perspectives, and especially the uncomfortable ones like that of the Phanariots, is at the heart of democracy and democratic society. And the best sign of Greece's vibrant democracy is the inclusion of this panel in the Delphi Economic Forum this year. And with that, I close. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, dear colleagues. It was a pleasure to listen and to reflect while you kept adding layers and layers of complexity without losing sight of the fact that we are thereby, by adding complexity, not just making things complicated, but reaching a deeper understanding. And I'm also quite appreciative of Christine's final comments that that deeper understanding may also be very meaningful for us to construct our present and future in a better way. It's not idle academic exercise. And thank you all for both giving us close-ups, some more so than others, but also keeping the larger, broader picture of the Ottoman Empire constantly there as it moved and shifted while the Greek Revolution unfolded just before and after, starting in Syria and touching on Egypt, bringing in the Albanians, and finally with the Greek community all over the empire and beyond, as the story of the Greek state was happening. But there is probably an even broader kind of world picture that we did not touch here. You know, the literature on the age of revolutions is quite familiar to all of you. Some of you have done more work on it than I ever have. What about that larger international setting of an age of revolutions, even if we don't agree with that historiography, but we do know of the French Revolution, of the American Revolution, and various other intellectual and political developments that are known, or at least seem to me to be obvious, to have made some inroads into the way things took shape. Would you care to comment on the larger international setting and how that played into the story of the Greek Revolution? I have other questions too, of course, depending on how much time we can have, but let's start with this one. And whoever wishes to take it, starting with Ioannis, following the same order. Dr. Grigoriadis, if you care to answer it.
Well, I think that the Greek War of Independence had roots in the Neo-Hellenic Enlightenment movement. That is very much a European, Central Western European intellectual movement that produces a lot of thinking about Greek identity. The whole discussion between Hellene and Rum or Romnios, and this whole discussion about where would the Greek nation stand is very much related to developments in the late 18th, early 19th century. There are different understandings of where Greece should stand. There's the Rigas Velestin Lis, Rigas Phareos understanding that's more inclusive and kind of envisions Commonwealth coming out of the Ottoman Empire. So he's not really thinking of establishing a Greek nation state per se, but tries to find space for the Turks, for the Albanians, for the Jews, for everybody who lives in the Ottoman Empire, of course. And I do think that the constitutions of the revolutionary years reflect very much this very interesting and very fruitful intellectual fermentation that begins in the big Greek diasporic communities of Western and Central Europe. Then it moves into the big Ottoman cities where there are these Ottoman Greek communities that are educated and they're in good connections with this diasporic communities. And this is all reflected into the texts of the Greek Revolution, the constitutional text, and the discussions. Of course, reality and sort of realism, political realism, means that the Greek state will not be a republic, will be a kingdom, and it will be an absolutist kingdom. But all these discussions are going to be reflected into what transpired in Greek intellectual and political history throughout the 19th century. So it's not a surprise that Greece establishes a parliamentary system like relatively early compared to other European states in the 19th century. So there are many interesting connections.
We don't hear you, Hakan. You're muted.
You don't? Am
Now
I?
we do. Now we do.
How
Yes,
you
now
do?
you're fine. Yeah.
Okay, so I go on. I was just saying that at one point, Philliou said that people lived the revolution in their own way. I mean, this was inescapably so. I mean, people had different experiences. Yes, there was an international dimension to it. I mean, when Lord Byron, for example, came to fight on behalf of the Greeks, the Ottomans recorded his name, that he was a British noble, and when he died, his death was reported near Missolonghi. At one point, the Ottomans realized that there was more to the Greek Revolution than an ordinary revolution on grounds of tax grievances, etc. At one point, they may not know whether the Greeks had their intellectual, precursors and leaders like, the Velestinis or Adamantis Korais or people like that. But the more foreign powers began to have a hand in the actual state of affairs, the Ottomans could not be neglectful of that international dimension. Actually, it took a lot of persuasion, quote unquote, on behalf of the other great European states to persuade the Ottoman government that the Greeks should be independent. So there is an international dimension, and the Ottomans took note of it. But it was a funny world, contrary to our received wisdom. Actually, the same story repeating itself again and again, as in case of other fields of revolution, like the American Revolution, the kind of division between the loyalists and the patriots, the loyalists taking refuge in Canada, giving rise to the Anglo-speaking communities of Canada. We have the exact situation in this case as well. I mean, many of the Anatolian Greeks were actually recent immigrants who came to the Ottoman Empire after Greece became an independent country. So what was new for the Ottoman Empire was not to lose territory. What was new was that a group of subjects, Reaya, declared independence, got it, became an internationally recognized state, but there were a lot of more Greeks living outside the boundaries of Greece in the Ottoman Empire. So there wasn't an easy solution to this ambiguous ethnicities and loyalties. People lived in the Ottoman Empire. They were recent arrivals from Greece, and their loyalty, God knows, laid where, but they were Ottoman citizens. But at one point, whenever there was a Greek consul somewhere in Western Anatolia, they could go and register there as Greek citizens this time. So, mind-boggling. Why should people immigrate to Ottoman Empire and be loyalist in that sense? And a few decades later, they go to the Greek consuls and register themselves for Greek citizens. So these are questions to chew on. But yes, there was, undoubtedly an international dimension to it, and the Ottomans duly took note of that. They couldn't have otherwise. I mean, that's my intake in a way.
Terrific. Thank you. Sukru, you?
Yeah. Well, we want to include the Greek War of Independence in the so-called Age of Revolutions. However, the Greek Revolution broke out at a time of extreme conservatism all over, in all European kingdoms, the superpowers of the time. We are talking about the Vienna Conference period, where the Napoleonic Wars had finished and devastated most of Europe, and no European ruler wanted to see any kind of popular revolution, uprisings, revolutions anymore. And this is why most European powers patiently waited the Sublime Porte to suppress the Greek War of Independence. until they couldn't anymore. I mean, we see this in the communications of the British, French, Austrian embassies reports with their foreign offices. They, especially the Austrians and the British, helped the Ottoman state to suppress the Greek War of Independence. As I said, until they couldn't be impartial anymore.
Okay, terrific. And now I'm thinking if this could be part, if one should consider this part of the way Ottoman views of the Greek Revolution took shape. That's exactly why I wanted to bring up the larger question, but please, yes. Because the panel is, after all, about Ottoman views of the Greek Revolution, but yes.
Yeah, I was going to bring it back to that, and I had two sets of thoughts. One is that there's a kind of elision in Greek historiography about Greek Enlightenment to Greek nationalism. And in the Ottoman realms, that was not necessarily a foregone conclusion. There were plenty, like Phanariots, for instance, considered themselves enlightened. And many Levantines, the very first newspaper of the empire in Smyrna, in spring of 1821, days before the outbreak of the revolution, was by a Levantine, Black Bay, a Belgian Levantine, who started this newspaper for that very reason. He was enlightened. He was opposed to the French Revolution and then to the Greek Revolution as it broke out. So these things were not synonymous at the time necessarily. There were some people who thought that that was an obvious connection. And the second thing is that both the Ottomans as a whole and the Phanariots particularly were very focused on the international realm. Not as in the Age of Revolutions, but as in more like realpolitik before realpolitik, right? That there were factions, as we know. There were factions within the Ottoman court, factions within Phanariot circles, and factions in the early Greek state based on affiliation with one or another great power, right? The Anglophile party or faction, the Russophile. So I would say that that's how the international scene plays out in terms of Ottoman capabilities and horizons in confronting the War of Independence, and then the ways the Phanariots are implicated in it. It is inseparable, that international context.
Terrific. Lots of questions. One of my questions has to do with the legacy of Byzantium. The first paper actually triggered it with reference to the Melkites to begin with. It was right there in the first paragraph. And of course, your work, Christina, on the Phanariots has led many of us to reevaluate the question of Neo-Byzantinism, as some might call it. But Neo-Byzantinism has charges of a modern political movement in it. So let's leave that aside, but something about the legacy of Byzantium being taken seriously as one's identity, if not one's political something. What's the role of a new kind of reception of ancient Greek history, Byzantine history, but especially Byzantine history in the cultural framework of the Greek Revolution, do you think? Please, we're just starting. We're just getting into... No, I'm joking. Of course, you're right. We have to follow the program. But then I will leave you with this question and with hoping maybe Kristen will have a word or two. No?
Is there time? No time? Okay.
Okay. Next
To be
time,
continued.
friends, or when we see each other in person, I hope, at some point, to be continued. Thank you very much. This was a wonderful panel for me to reflect, as I said.
Thank you
to take with me.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. And in fact, I hope this kind of reasoning will make an impact on the field. That's what's going to be my final question eventually. How do you think all of this will be incorporated? How can it be more productively incorporated into Ottoman studies? This kind of broader vision that one is finally bringing to a major event like the Greek Revolution. So, thank you.